Key Digs a Hole by Danger Slater. We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will to be arrive where we started, and know the place for the first time. T.S. Eliot, Little Gidding. Part 1. Above. 1. The story goes like this. Harrison Moss swallowed a seed. It didn't taste very good, but he swallowed it nonetheless. Traveled down his esophagus and into his stomach where it germinated inside of his body. Then he started digging a hole in his backyard and he didn't know why. It was not a very deep hole, no, not at first. But one day it certainly would be. One day this hole will be deep and wide and black and empty. One day the edges of it will crumble apart like the crust of an old birthday cake. One day when this hungry earth can no longer suppress its own appetite, and it's finally forced to devour itself, you'll look back at this moment, at the very first chapter of the book that you now hold in your hands, and know that here is where it all began. This is the hole that will rebel against the sunshine. This is the hole that will steal away the world in one apocalyptic gulp. Look inside of it if you dare. Your gaze will fall into this hole and never come back out. It was past midnight, in the summer. One of those sticky kind of nights where the air was as thick as swamp water and felt more akin to swimming. Harrison Moss was asleep, but he was not dreaming. He had stopped dreaming years ago. What would be the point, you might say if you were to ask him? He already knew what lay on the other side of that night's slumber. Tomorrow, the next tomorrow, and every other tomorrow to come after all that, all lined up in a perfectly predictable row. The future was something he was certain would arrive. Because life until that point had been nothing if not comfortable. He had a wife, he had a job, he had heat and electricity and thick walls to protect him. I'm not going to sit here and judge a person for coveting these things. As unremarkable as these suburbs were, at least they were normal. They were easy. They were safe. Of course, one could also look at the world around Harrison, with its cookie-cutter houses and flawlessly manicured lawns, and find the whole thing suffocatingly dull. I certainly wouldn't judge a person for thinking that, either. My point is, what ameliorated some might set others to stew, and what provided him relief might cause you distress. Happiness was often malleable like that, with no firm recipe from which it was fashioned. I'm not here to tell you exactly how to feel in this moment. I merely wish to inform you that for our protagonist, Harrison Moss, this meant that there was no place left in his head for dreams, and that his sleep was as vast and as dark as any hole could ever hope to be. But on the night that he swallowed the seed, he suddenly found himself awake and anxious. Eyes wide and heart racing, his brain seemed to crackle with a dull kind of electricity, and yet his thoughts felt unfamiliar and distant, as if they existed in the fog of some bay, stranded onto islands all their own. He swung his feet around and stood up. Tabitha didn't move. She didn't even stir. He probably could have dropped a cinder block on her head and she wouldn't have even noticed. Just let it slip from his fingers and then splat. But where would he find his cinder block at this hour? Anyway, she was out cold, snoring gently, fast in the folds of their marital sheets. He climbed out of bed, moved purposely, silently, as lithe and elusive as the shadows on the walls, a shadow himself. Not even a creak in the floorboards dared to give his position away. The wood beneath his feet remained stiff, but loyal as he crept through the hallway and down the stairs. Outside he went. It was as hot in the backyard as it was in the house. A delicate breeze tousled what was left of his thin, greasy hair. His pale skin looked even paler under the unguarded light of the moon. He looked anemic, like he was made of smoke and ash. He looked like he was already a ghost. He stood there for a moment in just his underwear, papery and silver, and let the night heat paint his body in sweat, and he could hear them, voices, muffled, coming from underneath the dirt. The words they said were not spoken aloud. If you were standing next to him, you wouldn't have heard a thing. Rather, for Harrison Moss, it sounded like 1,000 separate voices had arrived in an instant, like a subway car he just let out inside of his head. It didn't strike him as odd then, though on any other night it certainly would have. Such is life in the first chapter of this book. Such is life after swallowing the seed. Every single one of these voices was saying the exact same thing. To the shed! Go to the shed! It wasn't a conversation. It was a demand. Now, in the shed, hedge clippers and weed whackers and great swooping loops of rubber green hose hanging down from the ceiling like cheap Christmas garland. A sepia-tinted mist demarcated the thin line between the shed's 40-watt glow and the encroaching darkness of the evening beyond. Harrison Moss pulled a small gardening trowel from his toolbox and inspected it. The metal began to oxidize around the edges. No one had touched it in years, if they ever had touched it in the first place. Sometimes he bought things and never used them. This shed was full of tools that were never used, and yet time set the rust to them anyway. Everything that existed in this universe existed inside of entropy's rotten jaws. As if to emphasize this, Harrison Moss picked up the trowel and held it up to the light. A few corroded screws were the only thing left connecting the head to its splintering handle. He then inspected his own arms. Once powerful and strong, they now seemed so fragile and useless. Decaying shafts of skin and bone stretched from his tired hands to his sloping shoulders. Time began to rust him away, too. The seed in his stomach twisted and turned, and made him feel ill, but not ill enough to get sick. The voices under the dirt kept whispering, "Don't be afraid. No need for fear. No pain. No fear." He looked to his right. There sat a single switch on the wall. He flicked it upward, and a previously powerless chop saw in the corner of the room suddenly sprang to life. Like a swarm of invisible insects, the deafening buzz of the rotating power tool filled up the shed. The blade of the chop saw was a blur of blue and gray that spun around and around. He set his eyes to the machine, tried to follow its ever-quickening movement, an impossible task at its current speed. He stared until his vision spun too, rendering him momentarily too dizzy to move. Still, he watched the blade, as if he were hypnotized. Harrison Moss was suddenly overcome with an immense sense of clarity, of calm. He couldn't explain it, but not just because he didn't fully understand it, but also because he hadn't the vocabulary. Still, he could most assuredly feel it. That much could not be denied. He didn't need a dictionary to know there was something in this moment. Something tantric, something cosmic. An indefinable feeling in which everything seemed to click into place, almost as if they were sky above and the ground below had somehow learned to sing in unison. Or maybe that wasn't exactly right. Maybe the sky and the ground were always in harmony, and he had only figured out how to listen. Harrison Moss was going to be okay. He had never felt more certain. And then he shoved both of his hands into the whirring blade. Oatmeal-thick clumps of wet, warm flesh splattered against the walls like they had been tossed by a defiant child. Blood surged from his wrists in crimson spades, soaking into the ground, covering his bare chest, staining his face red, so that just the whites of his eyes shone like lighthouses through the clotting gore. The smell of copper surfaced up from the mine shafts in his body. Cold steel chewed through his hands and vomited him back out, and still he dug in deeper. He pushed forward harder. He didn't even wince as the blade ripped through his palms and sent his fingers pointing opposite directions before severing them completely and shooting off into the darkness. And then, once he was finally and irreparably maimed, once he had no hands left at all, he pulled away. The machine stopped shrieking. The chop saw came to a halt. For the moment, all that existed was the sound of his breath and his rapidly beating heart. Bracing the tool against the wall, he thrust the wooden handle of the gardening trowel into the end of his open left wrist. Loose skin hung around it like the sleeve of a tunic. Displaced meat bubbled out like jelly around the trowel's base. Harrison buried the tool into the mutilated stump, pushing in as far as it would go, until it nestled itself tightly between his radius and his ulna. It felt almost as if his bones were reaching for it, like they were trying to grab it and hold on, like his skeleton was a separate entity from him and his body was merely terrarium in which it grew. Then he did the same thing to his right hand, this time inserting a cultivator, a tiny stainless steel garden rake, its 3 forked prongs stretching out like a crooked claw. Out in the backyard again, out into the night. He stood there, in the center of his yard. Air filled his lungs, in and out. The grass danced around his toes, moist, writhing. He bent down and got in close. So close he was almost hugging it, and he saw that it was not grass that surrounded his feet at all. The entire ground was covered with worms, hundreds of them, thousands even, squirming over each other like a living tapestry. His whole yard was moving. He brushed them to the side, slime coating his already blood-damp skin to reveal the cold dirt underneath. Harrison Moss slowly slipped the spade end of his new shovel hand into the soil. It passed into the earth as easily as a knife passing into butter. "It really is a lovely evening, isn't it?" he said to the worms. And he dug. 2. There is one other thing that warrants a mention, before we continue on to the next chapter and beyond. On the night that Harrison began digging his hole, he saw someone watching him from darkness. It was a lady, but it was not his wife. This lady was something else. Yes, that's a better descriptor. She was something else, not someone else. Because although the energy that surrounded her was decidedly feminine, she always remained far enough away from any of her distinguishing features, or just were obscured by shadows. Harrison couldn't even tell if she was human in shape. Though if she wasn't human, what shape could she be? She was in the bedroom with him when he first woke up, floating off to the side of his bed, where the sliver of moonlight from the window couldn't reach. She was in the shed with him. He could feel her presence even though that he couldn't see her at all. It was as if she was made of pure vibrations, as if she only existed in the screeching of the chop saws that bounced off the claustrophobic wood walls. And she was certainly there in the backyard as Harrison's newly repurposed hands burrowed and gouged their way into the earth. She watched him, silently. She lingered, faintly. Of course, with all the thoughts charging through his head at the time, Harrison hardly even noticed her. She was no more intrusive than the fog is loud. He stayed fastidious in his task, feverish even, determined to dig. And as sure as the world kept turning, dig he did. 3. It was several hours later when the morning reached his gelded fingers around the horizon and cracked it open like the shell of an egg. Daylight spilled across the city. The paperboy delivered the paper. A choral of ravens sang. The earthworms that filled his backyard that night before had long since retreated back to wherever it was they had come from, as did the phantasmagorical woman who watched him. She had evaporated alongside the morning dew. Okay, that she didn't actually evaporate alongside the morning dew. That was me employing poetic license, turning a phrase, creating a more colorful variation of the exact facts in order to elicit from you a fuller emotional response. Was it successful? Point is, she was gone. There was no trace left of her at all. "Harry?" Tabitha said, her voice cutting like a katana through the hemorrhaging dawn. Harrison kept digging, completely oblivious to the fact that his bewildered wife had been watching him for the past 5 minutes. "Harrison!" she said, louder. Still digging, he was undaunted. Scoop by scoop by scoop by scoop. "Harrison Moss, are you listening to me?" Harrison stopped and looked up towards her, squinting against the globe of the rising sun. Tabitha stood on the deck in just her bathrobe, mug of steaming black coffee in hand, head tilted slightly to the side, seemingly offset by the weight of her crooked and accusatory eyebrows. She didn't look happy, that much was clear. "Why are you yelling at me?" Harrison said. "I'm standing right here." "What the hell are you doing?" He rubbed the sweat from his forehead and motioned to the meter-deep ditch he had dug out overnight. "I'm digging a hole," he replied. "Yeah, I can see that," said Tabitha, "but why?" "Huh? Why are you digging a hole?" He paused and said, "Oh, geez, I don't know, Tabs." "You don't know?" she asked. "What do you mean you don't know?" "Why does anyone do anything?" "What?" "Look, I woke up last night and I had this feeling inside my head, inside my body. It made me want to dig a hole, so I did. You ever get that? You ever get a feeling, Tabitha?" "Have I ever got a feeling?" "How can I explain it?" he said. "It was like there was this thing that was buzzing around in my head like a mosquito or a gnat or something. But it was less defined than a mosquito. It didn't have a body or anything like that. It said it was lighter than air and made up of all shadows. And when I tried to look at it straight on, it slipped right through the cones in my eyes like it were a color that shouldn't exist." "What are you talking about?" He continued unabated. "This thing, this invisible thing, you know it's there, but you don't quite understand it. It don't make no sense to you, and so you write it off. You ignore it like you ignore the million other things that float through your head, and you just go about your day like it's any other day. And they'll let work for a minute, might even work for years if you're lucky. You walk around and smile and everything seems fine. And shit, maybe everything is fine, because that's what we built here together, Tabitha, a fine life. But suddenly there this thing is again, a dark wave, a tidal wave. And that's when you realize that this thing you've been trying so long to ignore is actually filling you up, filling up your whole body. And now it's everywhere. It's in your lungs as you breathe and on your lips when you speak, and it's running through your veins like it's on track shoes. And not only can you not avoid it anymore, but you are it. You are it, Tabitha. You are the thing. And it ain't even a choice after that. You have to do what it tells you, even if it not directly telling you to do anything. You understand what I'm trying to say to you?" She looked from her dirt-covered husband to the hole in the center of her now ripped-up lawn. "You're making a mess out there," she said. "Well, of course I'm making a mess," he replied. "I'm not done yet." 4. In the corner of the Moss's backyard there grew a peculiar-looking tree that bore from its branches a peculiar-looking fruit. This fruit was as meaty and purple as a human spleen. Dozens of these fruits dangled above, doing their best to imitate the stars they pulsated and throbbed. The tree from which they hung was a big tree, thicker and taller by far than any other tree in the neighborhood. Its bark looked like skin, like a tan layer of goose-freckled skin that had been stretched and wrapped around a monolith of sturdy but errant bone. It felt like skin, too. This strange tree was pliable in ways trees usually weren't. Were you to strike it, a welt would form. In the summertime, greasy droplets of liquid would condense along its shaft, as if it were sweating, and perhaps most disturbing of all were the branches that sprouted from its highest boughs, which appeared to be made up of human fingers, long, crooked fingers growing out another like river distributaries. The longer ones had over 20 knuckles running up and down their digits, bent in impossibly twisted directions. When the breeze would blow, the branches would thrum against the trunk. During a hurricane, it sounded like a round of applause. The tree was there when the Mosses moved in. They didn't plant it. They didn't even know what type of tree it was. Harrison went to the library once to do some research on it, see if he could figure out its name, identify its origin, learn something, anything about it at all. He spent the afternoon nose deep in encyclopedias, scouring the internet, rifling through books on biology and botany, flipping past page after page of the most arcane texts available on the subject of floral, arboreal nomenclature. All of this, of course, to no avail. This was a one-of-a-kind timber, unclassifiable at any known resource, growing exclusively in their backyard. As far as Harrison Moss could tell, taxonomically speaking, it didn't even exist. All the other houses in the cul-de-sac in which they lived had sycamores that lined their property, stout and verdant, covered in bushy branches so thick that leaves were forced to cascade over one another like a great green waterfall. These plants were so plentiful and so perfectly and purposely placed that this street couldn't have had any other name except Sycamore Lane. So that's what the people who designed the neighborhood had decided to call it. Shaded and quiet, predictable and secure. Could there be anywhere in the world more inviting or more benign than a street named Sycamore Lane? But the House of Moss sat like a pimple on the pastel face of this seemingly idyllic suburb. It wasn't the fault of its current residents, who, until the moment Harrison swallowed the spleen fruit seed from this bizarre tree and started digging his mysterious hole, were just as boring as the rest of their neighbors. Nor was it the fault of the building itself. The two-story colonial with the cadaver-colored shingles that hung from its front were like tags of skin. The house was as homogenized and antiseptic as the ones that lay to the left and right of it. Totally normal. No, it was that tree. That big, ugly monster tree with its strange and fleshy fruit that set this property apart from the rest. Tabitha had asked the realtor about it as she and Harrison had first toured the house. They'd already been through the kitchen and living room, the cellar and foyer, up the stairwell, down the hall, in and out of every back bedroom and every bath, then past the threshold of the back door, into the backyard. The tree was there when the neighbor was built, the realtor told them. We've had surveyors come here more than once. We're still not 100% sure of the full extent of its breadth, nor how deep down it goes. It's a big old bastard, that's for sure. It's a good chance that the root structure stretches from yard to yard like an underground parking garage. It could be secretly growing underneath every house in the cul-de-sac. The other residents wouldn't even know it. But is it safe? Asked Tabitha. Safe? The realtor laughed. Darling, I wouldn't be surprised if this tree was the only thing keeping the lane from collapsing on itself. Oh. The realtor then leaned in conspiratorially. Plus, and you won't see this in the official paperwork, but when we first tried to cut it down, the most unusual thing happened. What? Asked Tabitha, eyes wide. It started to bleed, Realtor replied with a raised eyebrow before quickly changing the subject back to the building. Anyway, as you can see, the oversized two-car garage is perfect for housing any vehicle you could possibly desire, from a Mini Cooper to a Humvee. Years later, Tabitha still thought the tree was creepy, the way it cast shadows across the kitchen, the gnarled finger branches reaching out from the top. It looked as if it were trying to pluck the sky right out of the sky. There was something foreboding about it, something sinister, malicious even, and those disgusting roots. She refused to even touch them. They'd sometimes ripen and fall from the tree's utmost branches, landing with such force it was almost as if they'd been thrown. They'd splatter against the ground, rupture open. White seeds the size of marbles would spill out, fleshy pearls encased by quivering pulp. She had seen Harrison sifting through a pile once. He was outside on his knees like a dog, face almost buried in the rotten paste. He pulled it out to see it and inspected it closely, like it were a rare gem he just found. Tabitha couldn't understand how he could hold it so close to his nose without getting sick. To her, the spleen fruit smelled worse than anything she'd ever smelled before. To her, the spleen fruit smelled like death. 5. Harrison Moss sat at the kitchen table, face caked in mud. Tabitha took the seat across from him and didn't say anything. His breath seemed to hiss like hydraulic brakes as it was forced through the twisted passageways of his nose. Aside from that, there was silence. A few triangular pieces of toast sat in a plate between them. Harrison raised an eyebrow. Tabitha motioned for him to eat it. He reached out and snatched them up, shoved all of them into his mouth at the same time. Breathing even louder, struggling to chew, smacking his lips together like a fish dragged to land. His wife looked away disgusted. Jesus, Harrison! Hungry, Tabitha, he said. I've been working all night. Working? This hole certainly can dig itself. Tabitha took a sip of her coffee and ground her teeth together as she listened to him wheezing through the food stuffed into his cheeks. Can I ask you a question? She finally said. Harrison's chewing slowed, then stopped. He forced the half-masticated wad down his throat. What? He said. Did you chop off your hands and replace them with gardening tools? Did I? He held up his hands, one a shovel, one a rake. Tiny piece of buttered toast still impaled on the end of one of his cultivator's prongs. Yeah, suppose I did. Don't you think we should have maybe, discussed it before we went ahead and made such an extreme and irreversible body modification? Maybe, he shrugged. Hey, do we get eggs to go with this? Maybe, she said. What do you mean, maybe? First off, it's not that extreme of modification. Here's my hand. It's not like, I don't know, I pulled out my appendix or gallbladder or anything like that. Secondly, I didn't know I needed your permission to ask every time I wanted to dig a hole or one of my appendages. Not a child, Tabitha, and I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself without you policing my every move. Although, truth be told, I've been thinking about replacing my legs, too. Maybe putting your drilling augers there. Right under my knees, so I could dig in faster. Do not cut off your legs. See? This is exactly what I'm talking about. They lapsed back into silence, staring at each other. Harrison took a loud sip of coffee. So where are they? She asked. Where what? The hole? Your hands, Harrison. Where are your hands? Still on the floor of the shed, I'd reckon, he said. Chopped up into a dozen little pieces and splattered against the wall. Oh, Jesus. There ain't no reconciling this, Tabs, he said. What's done is done. It was actually pretty brutal now that I think about it. Damn things didn't want to come off. I had to really shove them in there deep. Expect even you'd be able to find some sort of comfort in that, since you're obviously the kind of person who wants their hands still attached to her body. Tabitha shook her head in disbelief and pointed to the space where his left hand once was. That was the hand your wedding ring was on. Harrison looked at the shovel, turned back to her. So it was. Well, I'm just going to come right out and say it. I don't understand this behavior, Harry. This sudden fervor, this impulsivity, this isn't like you. Sudden? You think this is sudden? He smiled, dirt in the cracks between his teeth. There ain't nothing suddenly happening here. What looks like impulsivity to you is nothing but the inevitable end of a long and uncomfortable dream. I tossed and turned my way to this point, even if you couldn't tell because I looked like I was asleep. I ain't here a mistake, Tabitha. I haven't succumbed to an illness or an accident. This ain't no psychotic break. I woke up and looked outside. It's morning. What the hell are you even talking about? Are you Mr. Philosophy now, speaking to me in riddles, acting all cryptic? I'm supposed to be seduced or intrigued by any of this nonsense? You think you're Jean-Paul Sartre all of a sudden, or fucking Plato? Shook her head and exhaled dramatically. Tell me you had to wake up as if espousing some bullshit phrase like that means a goddamn thing in the real world. He shrugged, unfazed. Harry, you didn't even dress this morning, and you've certainly not been to the office like you're supposed to be. Today's no different every other day that came before it. You know this, and I know you, Harrison. I know the real you. This isn't right. This isn't normal. Before she could finish her sentence, Harrison's spine stiffened suddenly, as if loaded in a spring, and he pressed the backside of his right hand to his wife's lips. Cold steel against her sins shushed her almost immediately. Her paranoid eyes quickly darted back and forth. His chest heaved in and out faster. His nostrils flared. What? She started to say. Tabitha, he said as his gaze fell back on her. Tell me you can hear them. Hear you? Hear who? Them. The voices. What voices? She shouted. The voices in the backyard come up from under the ground. They're in my side of my head. They're the ones who've been taught me all night. The ones who told me to dig. That does it. Tabitha stood and grabbed the telephone off the receiver. I'm calling Dr. Catterwall. You're sick in the brain, Harrison Moss. You need professional help. In a single fluid motion, Harrison spun out of his chair and slammed his shovel into the wall, severing the phone line. Tabitha looked at him, her round face full of fear, mouth slightly open in shock as the curly cut wire dangled between them. Harrison, you're scaring me. They're screaming, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. They're screaming for me right now. What, what are they saying? She whispered back. He closed his eyes and concentrated, as if somehow, in the fresh darkness, the voices could be heard more clearly. When he opened them again to look at his wife, a muddy tear rolled down his cheek before falling off the end of his chin. They want me to join them, he said, then added, they want us to join them. 6. Let's work backwards. Let's take a look at Tabitha Moss earlier that morning as she woke to find her husband's side of the bed empty. The bottom sheet flat and unwrinkled, as if he'd never been there at all. Let's watch silently as Tabitha sat up and sniffed the air. She couldn't smell him. The accumulated stress the day before fermenting in his pores overnight, filling the room. She sniffed again. Nothing. He was gone. He'd been gone for hours. This entire scene played out very early before the dawn had crested over the distant city skyline. Before she knew he was in the backyard digging. She listened closely. Only quietude. The house they shared was haunted by nothing. No apnectic shuffling of her slumbering groom, not the creaks of his heavy feet as they plodded across the floor, not the steady whisper of the shower's steam as it passed through the crack at the bottom of the closed bathroom door. She looked at the clock. He couldn't be at work yet. Bustown Down didn't leave for another hour and a half. And so she thought. Maybe he had left her. Maybe he was gone for good. He could have easily packed up his suitcase while she was still sleeping and slunk his way out the door without a peep. He could have chattered a taxi and told the man behind the wheel to just keep driving, and down the highway they would have roared until the two of them plummeted off the edge of the world. He could have hitchhiked his way to the middle of the desert so he could live on his belly among the scorpions and snakes. He could be in jail. He could be dead. She let the particular thought echo in her head for a while. He could be dead. Dead. D-E-A-D. Her husband, the corpse. Her husband, the waterlogged body at the bottom of the lake. Her husband, the lunch buffet for a flock of hungry buzzards. He was gone, that much was certain, and she had no idea where he was. For all she knew, she may never hear from him again. She imagined what that would be like. Her life from this moment on, without him there, feeding on her emotional well-being like a parasite chewing through her heart. And although she didn't leap out from the sheets to express this notion out loud, although she barely allowed herself to acknowledge it a vile and destructive notion internally, she thought of his face, his stupid, sullen face now rendered bloated and blue and cold and dead, made her smile. But let's go back even further than that. Let's talk about last year, and the year before that, and all the years that led up to the day when Harrison Moss swallowed a spleen-throat seed and started digging a hole in his backyard. Because Harrison Moss had not always been the type of man who sought to dismantle the earth. Before he began this absurd and all-consuming endeavor, he had lived a life that, by all comparative definitions, would have been considered excessively normal. Painfully, mind-numbingly, acquiescently normal. Harrison would rise from the alarm on its obnoxious blare. He'd bathe, shave, squeeze his tired body into a business suit. His coffee was so black and hot that it would burn his throat like a battery acid as he sucked it down. Where he'd left, he'd always kiss his wife on top of her head, a sterile smile, perfunctory and passionless like he was wife-kissing robot, programmed to dole out her husbandly affection, one tiny fraction at a time. And she'd sit in her bathrobe and let his dry lips scratch against her scalp like there was still some comfort to be found in that. And as he walked out the door, she'd offer him some exhausted valediction like, "Have a good day at work, honey," and he'd say, "I love you," and she'd say, "I love you too," and the words would feel like cotton, filling up their mouths. And then we'd follow Harrison down the walkway to the local bus stop, where the other husbands in the neighborhood would already be standing, waiting to get picked up and taken to the office downtown. "Morning, Brad," Harrison would always say when he saw his neighbor, Brad Flatley. "Morning, Harry," Brad Flatley would always say back. and the bus would putter into the cul-de-sac and pull up to the curb, and the door would open and with a rusty screech, and Harrison and Brad and the rest of the men of Sycamore Lane would line up in a single file, and they would board, and the bus would drive off, and soon the residential neighborhood would disappear, giving way to the gray towers of the budding city, sticking up from the ground like vampire fangs. And they all went to work in the office, Monday through Friday, week after week. This is the life that he'd been working so hard to maintain. Year after year, decade after decade. This was the prize. The pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. And they lived happily ever after. He had always been promised at the end of every fairy tale he ever read. Look, you get it. You're not stupid. I know you get it. You're a savvy reader. What I'm talking about here is well-worn territory in pretty much every facet of modern fiction. Have your main character, in this case Harrison Moss, traditionally white, traditionally middle class, traditionally male, encumbered by some tedious and ill-defined version of existential ennui, which leads him, unsurprisingly, to certain personal relations, a peeling back of the curtain so the dark underbelly of the suburbs can finally be exposed. Ooh, so edgy. We've all been here before, literature-wise. Probably the time we graduate from 10th grade, if not sooner. So if you're looking for a long digression that thoroughly explores this thesis, please go read Death of a Salesman or watch American Beauty, or consume one of the several thousand of other books and movies that deal with this particular topic. Arthur Miller did it way better than I'm ever going to, and he did it a half century before I did. So although this office, this job, this commute, and this routine had already taken up large swaths of Harrison's life thus far, in the grander scheme of things, that this particular novel has left to say, it is all rather relevant. So instead of this boring old trope, let's talk about the day that Harrison and Tabitha's genitalia disappeared. Or perhaps disappeared is the wrong word. It was more like they healed over. This happened years ago, before the morning that Tabitha woke up alone, before Harrison caught up his hands and replaced them with the gardening tools, long before he began to dig. It wasn't immediate. A magician didn't come by and wave his wand like abracadabra and then poof. Both of their bits were suddenly flat-patched. There was no horror in this discovery either. No shrieking mourning after the sex organ bandit absconded away in the night. It was more like a slow recession. The ebbing of a tide, a mountain eroding. The penis retreating back into the body, the vagina closing up like two tectonic plates have been pushed together. Their genitals receiving, until the only thing both of them contained between their legs was just smooth skin, raw and red like mosquito bites. They hardly even noticed. But this wasn't always the case, of course. Once upon a time, Harrison and Tabitha Moss were newlyweds, and they were full of passion. They would make love the same way the thunder rolled in, slow and deep. It would make the windows shake and the earth rumble. Afterwards, they would watch TV together, lounging opposite ends of the couch, toes touching beneath the fleece blanket they shared. At one point, this house was new, or rather, new to them. They just moved in. Boxes full of their possessions filled the garage. The neighborhood still felt alien, a welcoming yet strange landscape that these two lovers had suddenly landed in. Even the neighbors, what was their name, the Flalleys, seemed incongruously, even farcically friendly. They had greeted them with a basket full of muffins and big stupid mannequin smiles, mere minutes after the moving truck had arrived. "Welcome to the neighborhood, buddy," said Brad, forcing Harrison to a brotherly hug. "Oh my god, I love your dress," his wife Jennifer screamed in Tabitha's face. "How about them Giants, huh?" Brad thrust a beer into Harrison's hand. 9-0 already this year. You think they'll take the conference? "Here's a helpful tip. Create a professional in your garage to get the smells of rotten fruit at bay," Jennifer said. It was so overwhelmingly pedestrian, these space invaders from planet Normal, with their banal enthusiasm bubbling up all over their hapless new neighbors. "That's not us, is it?" Harrison asked Tabitha later that night. "Of course it's not," she laughed. "It'll never be us." But within the very same week, Tabitha found herself spinning circles in the center of the spare bedroom, across the hall, scornfully inspecting the empty walls. Her eyebrows furrowed, her lips in a pout. The room was white, too white, and she didn't like it. "You need to relax, Tabs," Harrison said to her, leaning up against the doorframe. "Why do anything at all? This room looks just fine to me, just like the other rooms. Everything is fine. White's a good color." White isn't a color, he said back to him. Not to get technical about it, but isn't white all of the colors mixed up in equal parts? It doesn't work, she said. It feels unfinished. Unfinished? I just want to make this place ours, you know. He faced her husband. Cover all the old shit our people left here. Erase it. Start over fresh. So she painted the room red, the color of passion. But it didn't look right either. It still felt off. Somehow wrong. Maybe it was because the shadows spilling in through the windows. Tabitha walked out and looked out. That nasty spring fruit tree cast its shade directly into the room, creeping across the floor and splashed out along the walls. It made it hard for her to see the colors in their true hues. It was frustrating. So she tinkered. The red paint soon begat orange, which soon begat yellow, which soon begat green. Of course, then that begat the blue that begat the indigo, which led to the purple, and then back around again to the red. The shades subtly different tints every single time she passed through the rainbow, almost imperceptible, except to her. Crimson, amber, chartreuse, cobalt, lavender. Nothing felt right. So she kept repainting it. Again and again. Of course, if we're really going to go back, if we're really going to cast our sociological gaze on the point in which this relationship was forever and irreversibly doomed, we're going to have to go all the way back to the point before it was forever and irreversibly doomed. The point at which two broken people met each other for their first time and decided that maybe they would feel less broken together. This point is bigger in scope than just the stormy marriage of Harrison and Tabitha Moss, and although the moment you're about to read is quite specific to the two of them, this is actually the origin of all love, because no matter what we do, every tragedy started out as a comedy, and every pile of trash was once someone's treasure. So here we are on the day they met. We are in one of those big box hardware stores, the kind with the sprawling black parking lots that take up large tracts of real estate in the edge of town. Just one in a series of adjacent strip malls. Walmart, Best Buy, Bed Bath & Beyond. These stores circle the suburbs like castle walls, keeping people out, or maybe keeping people in. We are in Home Depot. We are in aisle 11, where the invisible man floating behind Harrison Moss as he stood there in front of a massive rack full of rope. Young Harrison still had all his hair, thick and brown, grown out and pushed back in a socially acceptable state of distress. Sideburns squared up his jaw like that of an action figure. His body was svelte and clean. There were no wrinkles pinching the corner of his eyes, no gut to hang over the end of his belt. No, his confidence had not yet been eroded by the chisel-happy hand of time. He was there to buy tools, perhaps a shovel, perhaps a gardening trowel. He might need a gardening trowel one day. He didn't own one. He didn't even own a garden, but you never know. Instead, he ended up looking at the ropes, staring at them. And then there was Tabitha, stepping up right next to him. Young Tabitha, what a stunner. Her eyes, the color of grapefruit, parted slightly, revealing the peak of that crooked left incisor, curvy and sensual, soft yet fearless. Her heterochromatic eyes, one green and one brown, eating and digesting the chain store's uninspired neon light differently. She was just distinctive enough to be her own beautiful breed. Neither of them yet realized that this was one of those felicitous moments that blow in on sudden and nebulous winds, the kind that are able to permanently readjust the topography of the map of the world they had internally constructed. Neither one knew then that by the time this book is concluded, that together they will have literally torn this world apart. It's almost like being in a cave, isn't it? Harrison quietly said. Huh? Tabitha replied, shooting a cautious look towards the strange and attractive man next to her. This store, he turned. It's so big. And these ropes are hanging down over the place. Kind of look like vines, don't they? It's like we're in a cave, like we're underground. There ain't a window around here. I doubt the sun has ever seen the spot we're standing in. I suppose, she shrugged. Guess I never thought about it before. Yeah, well, most people don't think of what's underground until they find them trapped in a pine box beneath it, and that's just how it goes. So what are you, a geologist or something? Nope, he said. Well, why don't you enlighten me then? Harrison. I'm Harrison. What do you know about the Earth that I don't? Well, for one thing, it's everywhere. Come on, I know that much, she giggled. Yeah, but have you ever really thought about it? Of course, I'm thinking about it right now, he replied. No, 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 don't be silly. Look, he said as he picked up a nearby plunger. He reached for her hand and she pulled back. He didn't flinch, though, and he kept his open palm extended, looking at her with gentle eyes. After a moment, she let him take her tiny hand into his. He held her by the pointer finger in a circular motion around the rubber rim, along the out bottom edge. See how the ground covers the entire earth, and then there's us. He stopped her finger. That's the tiny plot we're on right now. And we are so small, me and you. We only get to touch the surface of it. She moved her finger away from his, dropping it down the empty cavity in the center of the plunger head so it hovered there, right in the middle. What about here? She said. The world continues on inwardly for thousands of miles, and there's so much space in there. So many unknowns, so much left to explore. There's still so much mystery. Exactly, said Harrison. And where there is mystery, there is hope. Anything is still possible beneath our feet. Anything? Indeed. So do you think there are caves shaped like Home Depots inside the earth? She said. He shook his head. Could be, I don't know. He put the plunger down. Two of them fell silent, and their smiles slowly faded. Tabitha pulled a length of half-inch thick twine out of its spool and inspected it as carefully as she would a parachute cord. It really is such a peculiar concept, she said. What is? Harrison asked. Death, she replied. Is it? Think about it. We have the potential to do so much. It's right there in front of us, all these options, all these chances, and yet most of us squander it away. We're afraid or distracted, or we just lack the motivation to even try. And even if we have the desire, it somehow still feels impossible. Being alive almost feels impossible. I wake up every day so goddamn confused as to how I even woke up at all. I don't find death all that peculiar, Harrison said. No? It's a simple equation with a zero sum, and it's universal. It reaches out and takes everyone with the same cold and calculated hand. If you're open to it, you'll be able to find beauty and symmetry in that. You find symmetry in the fact that one day you're gonna die? No, but I find symmetry in the sameness that death brings. But doesn't that seem unfair? She said. Doesn't the knowledge of your immortality fill you with an overwhelming sense of dread? Doesn't it consume you like it consumes me? How can we find meaning, find love in the face of such hopelessness? In the end, he said, pointing at the ropes, we either let the fear destroy us or we do our best to distract ourselves from it. Because no matter how many lights we leave on at night, the darkness is still out there waiting. She bit the inside of her cheek and looked young Harrison in his sad, hazel eyes. Look, I know I don't really know you, she said, but I was thinking maybe we don't have to buy these ropes, at least not today. We could, I don't know, go out for a coffee together instead and just talk. The ropes still hung. We're only delaying the inevitable, he said. I know, she replied, and they went and got coffee. 7. There was music hidden in every single scoop that Harrison pulled out of the ground. If you were listening carefully, you could hear it too. There was the staccato swish of his steel spade as it sliced into the dirt, the snare pop of his bones as he twisted his wrist, the mucousy sigh of the shifting terrain, almost as if the earth itself were catching its breath between arias. It was a clandestine symphony just beneath the soil. Of course, all that beauty was lost on Harrison Moss, who couldn't be bothered to listen at all. The man who was forcing the world to sing in his wake could only grunt and suffer as he worked. He was compelled to dig. He needed to dig. And he had been singularly focused on this task for the past week. It had been 4 days since Harrison woke in the middle of the night and replaced his hands with a shovel and a rake. It had been 1 day longer than that since he swallowed the mysterious seed from the spleen fruit tree. And while the hole in his yard steadily grew larger by the minute, an entirely different narrative had been unfolding in concurrent time within the corridors of Harrison's own body. First, it wasn't serious, just a tickle in his stomach, like he drank too much orange juice. No cause for alarm. And as the night proceeded on, as routinely as the nights before it, Harrison hadn't thought much of that peculiar tree or how its spleen fruit fell, as the spleen fruits often did, from the top of its highest branch. It landed in front of him with a splat, a comet of meat, the impact splitting the rind open along its seam. Pink, fleshy pulp spilled out, the stench of death released in a malodorous instant. White seeds, like fatty tumors, rolled across the barrel-kissed lawn, almost like eggs, like eyes, like a bag full of eyeballs, like the tree was looking at him from 24 different angles at once. Harrison stared at those seeds, and those seeds stared back at him. It was a moment of weakness. He could have just ignored it, but those damn seeds with their unblinking eyes, they were dissecting him with a rotten gaze. He had to know what they were looking at, and so he bent down, dropped to his knees like about to pray, and plucked a singular seed out of the goop. Just a single seed. Just one. You know, there's nothing to see here that already hasn't been seen 1,000 times before, he said out loud. I am not a character in your storybook, and this is not a tale that some author is telling. I am just a simple man in a simple house living a simple life. Why would I want for more? This might have been wishful thinking on Harrison's part, because as evidenced by you reading these words right now, this clearly is a story being told, and stories, as I'm sure you know, often unfold in very measured and contrived ways. And it should be established that by now that he was clearly a man and wanted more, so perhaps it is with the knowledge that the plot must move on that Harrison Moss felt compelled to tilt his head back, extend his jaw, and drop the spring fruit seed into his open mouth. It rolled down his throat like a shot of whiskey, swallowed into the pit of his stomach. And the night continued, and Harrison continued with it. He ran in the treadmill and he watched Jeopardy on the TV, and when the clock struck 9:30, both he and Tabitha climbed into their bed and went to sleep. And all the while that seed in his belly had begun to sprout. The casing split, opened up inside of him. It hatched. Wispy roots poked around his intestines until they found their way into his bloodstream. They wrapped themselves around his veins like ivy and crisscrossed his vision like strands of loose hair growing on the backside of his corneas. The roots snaked their way through his muscles and wreathed around his feeble bones before finding purchase in the folds of his slumbering brain. It wasn't painful. Not at this point, at least. The seed grew as naturally as he was breathing. If I didn't just outright tell you about it, you would have no idea there was anything going on inside of it at all. Tabitha certainly didn't, and neither, for that matter, did Harrison himself. He had stopped thinking about the seed almost as soon as he finished swallowing it. In fact, he might have never thought about it again, were it not for the tiny leaf that sprung from the dark alley of his ear canal on the afternoon of that following Thursday as he stood there in the hole he had now dug. The size of a cemetery plot. He plucked the leaf out of his rake hand and inspected it, waxy and green like poisoned sumac. He barely had enough time to contemplate the what and why of it, to draw the tenuous chronological lines between seed and plant before the wind came by and snatched it away, sent it to flutter, disappear into the sky. The spleen fruit tree slowly clapped. 8. Tabitha watched Harrison. Watched him for days as the hole in the backyard grew from a minor ditch to a 6-foot chasm, then wider and deeper still, like an impact crater from a meteorite, concave on the bottom, raised up stiff and hard around the rim. There was no wavering in his resolve, and no inherent reasoning behind his behavior, at least not as far as Tabitha could discern. You know you're not supposed to be hearing voices, she said to him one afternoon as he continued to shuffle downward. The world isn't a radio that you're able to tune in and out of. Those screams you heard inside your head, they don't exist. He didn't say anything, so he continued. So she continued. You know they have a name for people who hear things that aren't there, right? They call them schizophrenics. Schizophrenia? No, 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 he chuckled, his smile shining through the dirt that covered his face. That's not what's happening here. What is happening here, then? What are we supposed to do when words start to fail us? How can we even feel emotions that we don't have the vocabulary to express? These voices I'm hearing, they're not even voices. They don't speak to me anymore than my own voice does. They're more like an idea, a compulsion. They want you to dig. There is no they, Tabitha. That's what I'm getting at. They is me. There is no schism between my thoughts and my actions. Maybe between them and I. If control is the issue, then I'm piloting the ship. If anything, I might be piloting the ship for the first time. He stopped digging and held up his shovel hand so she could see it. This is what a sane man does when he's run out of explanations and run out of options. She motioned to the giant dirt pit in front of her. This is your definition of sanity? She said. Foundations are laid underground, Tabs, he said. Burial plots are underground too. Don't be so dramatic. You're the one being dramatic, she shouted. You're the one destroying our yard. It's just a yard. But it's our yard. It is? Ethan repeated the same mantra he'd been saying ever since the excavation began. You have to trust me, he said. He continued to work. But of course, she didn't trust him. How could she trust him? None of this made sense to her. And although you have the luxury of looking upon the situation with the detached curiosity of a lazy anthropologist, Tabitha Moss had no other choice but to watch her husband in the backyard like a prisoner would watch their executioner sharpening an axe. What was he trying to accomplish? What was his end game? In a way, she blamed herself. How could she not? She wondered what she could have done to circumnavigate this crisis. And in almost the same breath, she wondered if she could have avoided it at all. She wondered, where do I fit into this story? Am I the catalyst here? The fuse? The powder keg packed with TNT? Am I the creator or the destroyer? Am I the victim or the victimizer? Or maybe it's something else entirely, she mused aloud. Harrison was outside, standing deep in the ditch. She was standing in the kitchen, and no one else was there. Well, no one else, that is, except for you, the reader. So I guess that means she's talking directly to you, and even though the two of you aren't sharing the same physical space, even though it's all but impossible for the two of you to ever share the same physical space, you are still the only one around to listen to her. And so you listen. You see, there was no cataclysm, no hard line drawn in the sand. No, you won't find any obvious reason that our marriage fell apart. It would be too simple, too convenient, and this isn't about convenience. This book is about the sticky and complicated in-betweens, the way things fall apart, the emotional gorge they leave behind, the near impossibility of filling all that back in, and everything else that was bound to transpire at the very tail ends. Do you consider yourself broken? It's not your voice asking that question. You don't have a voice. You are passively watching this whole story unfold. Thing is, a voice didn't actually ask that question at all, but Tabitha continued to answer regardless. I'm not broken. I sometimes feel like the only person in the world who isn't broken. Imagine how strong I might be to even keep up with this charade to begin with. I'm a rock, solid, unflappable. Of course, loneliness is intrinsic, wouldn't you agree? We are but one person, in a population of many. Loneliness is built into everyone, like the original sin. It's the very fabric of the human condition is sewn from. She looked out the window at Harrison. From this angle, with his body hunched over, he looked like an animal. This certainly isn't the man I married. And not just physically, either. His confidence breaks my zealotry. His charisma has healed over like the bark on a birch tree, and whatever sickness has seized his bones seems to have seized his brain as well. And after all these years together, do you still consider yourself the same as what you've always been? You got older. We both got older, sure. Can't help that. It's just the weight of all that innate loneliness. Time certainly doesn't lighten the load, does it? It warps you. Slowly but surely. Oh man, look at the backs of my hands. She holds up her hands for you to inspect. Fleshy and dry, not like gardening tools at all. Look at those veins, blue and distended. They're different from they used to look, but the blood inside them is still the same blood, isn't it? Inside I'm still the same person I've always been. I'm the sane one here, not like that psychopath in the backyard. Mutilating his body on purpose, upending our lives, trying to answer to some absurd whim. You think I wanted with our shitty relationship? God, no. What are her options? Letting the darkness win? Waiting for some kind of freak accident to come along and take care of this decision for me? Someone has to be the glue that holds this house together. What is life without the pursuit of normalcy? She continued. And plus I have this sphere I'm working on. I got my own project to complete. I know it's been years, but I almost figured out the perfect color. I'm like right there with it. Once I paint that room, I can move on to the rest of the house. And once I paint this whole house, we can finally get settled and truly call this place home. I thought Granny Smith Green was going to be it, but then I realized the room should be a bit more of a key lime. Of course that didn't feel right, and I had to move on to light jade, which ended up being too light, so I cover it with fern. Truth was, the man in the backyard became a stranger to her long before he started to dig. And she became a stranger too, with each new coat of paint she slathered on top of the last. Loneliness was a disease for which there was no cure. Tabitha noticed the arm with the shovel on the end to take in a pallid and sickly hue. She figured it was sepsis, blood poisoning. Right around the nub, where the handle had been forcibly shoved into the skin, green pockets of pus had formed. Putrid slime ran down his rancid wrist. Infected green slime, Tabitha said. Perhaps that's the color the spare room should be. That night, when he finally tired himself out and climbed into bed with her, passing out almost immediately, she reached over and felt his skin. Hard, husky. It felt almost like wood. And when he got up in the morning, looked behind a pile of leaves beneath the sheets. 9. Saturday night was barbecue night here in Sycamore Lane. We cooked hot dogs and hamburgers. We had on our Hawaiian shirts and khaki shorts. We wore our floral paint-printed sundresses and white frilly aprons. We sat in the patio and slurped shiny beer from dark amber bottles, and we talked about professional sports and projects at work and what a bang-up job the local government is doing. We commented incessantly about the stupid fucking goddamn weather. Brad Flatley and his wife Jennifer would come over. A big bowl of potato salad in Jennifer's hands. Brad holding a six-pack of watery domestic. Ding dong, neighborinos, Brad would say with a ceramic smile as he peeked his head around the side of the house. Harrison and Tabitha would be in the backyard, smiling ceramic smiles back at them. 3 hours later, and Brad would polish off his last beer and yawn, raising his arms high into the air, making a big display of it like he just crossed the finish line at the Tour de France. And he'd say something stupid like, I think it's time to hit the old sack, what do you say, hon? And Jennifer would absentmindedly nod and say something to Tabitha like, thanks for the evening. And they would leave. On Sunday we'd mow our lawns. By Monday we'd be back in the bus downtown, our way to work. But that was before the whole. Now the burgers sizzled on the grill, going from medium rare to well done as both Brad and Jennifer Flatley confusedly watched their deranged neighbor toss clump after clump of cold wet sod over his weary shoulder. So what's the deal? Brad eventually said. You guys getting a pool or something? Ooh, we should get a pool, Brad, said Jennifer. You don't long enough on the pool? She's wanted a pool for a long time, Brad chuckled. Next renovation, sweetie, I promise. Maybe we can even Harrison to dig it for us, since he seems so dedicated to this little hobby here. I mean, I love you, darling, but I'm not about to chop my hands and replace them with shovels. By the way, Harrison, are those, permanent modifications? The skin had grown over the handle of the trowel, fusing to it. Pinched flesh, red and green and raw, weaved its way through the fibers of the woods at besides the metal into the trowel's blade. You couldn't tell where the shovel began. Do I look like I'm fucking around, Brad? Said Harrison. You totally got us, Tabitha quickly interrupted her husband. We weren't going to mention it before, but Harry is so excited it just seems to want to work on it all day. Every day. I mean, why else would someone wanting to go like this in the backyard if not to install a pool? Harrison stopped and glared up at his wife. What are you doing, Tabitha? What? She said. Why are you lying to them? Tabitha laughed awkwardly. What are you talking about, darling? This isn't a pool and you know that. Honey, please, Tabitha threw a forced smile. We have company over. Wait, said Brad. If it's not a pool, then what is it? Harrison stood there for a moment, silent, save for the sound of the crickets in the bushes and the hiss of the meat burning over the charcoal. Brad and Jennifer exchanged a puzzled glance. Harrison sighed as he anchored his shovel hand in the dirt and used it to pivot his body out of the hole. He stomped his way across the yard, past his uncomfortable wife, and up onto the patio. There he stood, as metaphorically tall as a spleen fruit tree, towering over his two seated neighbors. Hey, Harry, I didn't mean to offend. Don't you ever want more? Harrison cut him off, nostrils flared and teeth like millstones between his jaws. Oh, come on, man, Brad said, shifting clumsily in his seat. What are you talking about? Life. Harrison said, holding his arms out wide, gesturing to everything around him. All of it! Do I ever want more life? Brad flatly asked. I don't understand the question. You don't understand, Harrison scoffed. Of course you don't understand. You're so wrapped up in this bullshit, this comfortable bullshit we've been sustaining ourselves on that you can't think of anything beyond it. It's just a puppet show, a facsimile of happiness. We fill ourselves with these empty calories like it's our dessert. Is this all there is? Just tell me, Brad. When you sleep at night, when you dream, what do you see? What? It's blackness, isn't it? There is a rumble, like the roar of distant thunder, except it was coming from underneath their feet. Vibrations cast upwards. Through the ground, clumps of dirt shifted and slid, almost imperceptible at first, but steadily growing in intensity. Soon the whole yard churned like an upset stomach. Blackness, said Brad. Blackness. Emptiness. A trench the size of an eternity, filled up by nothing. Sleep bookended only by those flaccid and Xerox days. This consciousness like an albatross around your neck, like a noose. You don't dream anymore, do you, Brad? Brad swallowed hard as he struggled to find his voice. No. He was finally able to mutter. No, I don't dream. Harrison leaned in close now so his mouth was right next to Brad Flatley's ear. Brad could feel his neighbor's hot breath against the hairs on the back of his neck. The rumbling from beneath the ground got even louder, like feedback through a bass amp. You're already under the dirt and you don't know it, Harrison growled through his teeth. We're all already under the dirt, and we're screaming to get out. Those are our voices down there, our ghosts, screaming for help, but we shut our ears. We don't want to listen. We fill our lives with every useless distraction we can find, and we act like we won something. But not me, Brad. Not anymore. I swallowed the seed. I reached downward, opened the door. I can hear us. Harrison, stop it! Tabitha reached out and laid her hand on her husband's shoulder. These are our friends. They are not my friends, Harrison replied as he spun around to face her. They are just the people who happen to live in the house next to ours. They're no more of my friends than the suit I wear to work is my skin. The whole yard shook harder. A tremor. A schism. An epileptic seizure. The windows on the house rattled. Empty beer bottles tumbled their way across the edge of the polyglass table before plummeting over the edge. They shattered against the stone patio. The dirt in the hole shook, seemed to boil. The low rumble escalated into a roar. You really think we should be going right now? Brad said as he slipped sideways out of his chair and grabbed Jennifer by the wrist. And what about you, Tabitha? Said Harrison, turning his attention to his wife. What lurks inside the darkness that fills you? When you sleep, what do you dream of? Harry, now is not the time to be talking about this. Thank you for the lovely evening, Brad called out. His voice wavered uneasily, though he still felt the need to remain dogmatically congenial, painfully gracious, but grudgingly polite, smiling like it was the only thing he knew what to do, like a ventriloquist dummy at the precipice of some relentless and all-encompassing cosmic horror, as the earthquake forced a river of worms up through the dirt in the hole. These were the very same worms that greeted Harrison on the night he started to dig, and once again, they were suddenly everywhere. They filled up the hole like spaghetti in a pasta strainer, squeezed in from every direction. They piled on top of one another, 2 inches deep. The crater was alive. It was reaching towards the sky. Brad and Jennifer scuttled towards the side of the house. They shuffled their feet in unison, step by careful step, but the ground was quickly eroding all around them, faster than they could move. The hole was growing exponentially. It was eating itself. And before Brad and Jennifer Flatley even realized it had happened, the hole had grown all around them. They were already inside of it. The worms writhed around their feet, moving in a frenzy, a slithering mass of hungry, wet mush. Jennifer was breathing heavily, in and out through her flailed nostrils, eyes wide with disgust. She and her husband clung to each other like trash in an ocean gyre. Brad? Jennifer eked as the worms slithered and surged. It's okay, Jen. Stay calm. We can just climb out. He reached over to the side of the hole and jumped to pull himself up. The moist clump of soil immediately broke loose in his hand, as another thick deluge of worms streamed out of the wall. Like a waterfall they poured, right into Brad Flatley's face. He went to scream, but the worms filled up his mouth, filled up his throat, filled up his stomach, filled up his whole body. He flailed around, cartoonishly waving his arms up and down like a flightless bird, able to breathe as the worms bored their way through the linings of his lungs. Crimson tears ran from his eyes and nose and dripped like jelly out of his ears. And then he slipped. He landed on his side in a puddle of wriggling, ravenous sludge. Jennifer yelped as she dropped to her knees next to her injured husband. "Get up, Brad, get up!" Red bloody welts were forming all over Brad's skin. The worms were biting into him, swarming around him as tight as a mummy's cloth, ripping chunks of flesh off his body as they went. The sound of sticky mouths chewing, tiny stomachs digesting, miniature assholes shitting. He was being eaten alive. Jennifer scooped desperately a handful of worms from Brad's ragged frame, but they stripped her hand of both muscle and meat before she could even toss them away. When she looked down, her legs too were already rendered into pink helves of bone, just the smallest globs of wobbling fat still attached to them. She couldn't stand up anymore. She couldn't run. Hungry and insatiable worms ravaged their way up her torso, organs spilling out of her yawning chest as the creatures parted the skin like the curtains of a stage. No longer having the strength to keep herself upright, Jennifer collapsed. She too was on her side, face to face with her husband. Brad was almost a skeleton now. The worms ripped him apart without respite, without mercy. He looked like he was dissolving, melting into the mire, becoming one with the ground. His tired eyes rolled towards his wife. "Brad, can you still hear me?" asked Jennifer. "Yes," he painfully burped, shook at her dying husband. "I just wanted you to know before we perish that I never loved you," she said. "Never." There was a moment where everything seemed still, where Jennifer's words registered in Brad's head, and then he reached out, pulled her close, embraced her. What was left of his cheeks perked up, forcing the slaughterhouse of his face into what could only be interpreted as a smile. "I never love you either," he said back to her, and they were both consumed, turned into dirt. Not even bones were left in their wake. The worms retreated back into the soil. Even though the worms were gone, the thunder growing from under the ground did not stop. The backyard still bellowed. The world still shook. The hole was not sated. It still grew deeper, wider, hungrier. "If now is not the time to talk about this, then when is?" Harrison asked his wife unabated. "When do we stop running? Stop pretending that tomorrow is some kind of concrete bunker for us to hide in? Is it the bomb about to go off in our faces? When do we finally admit that things aren't perfect, that they were never perfect, they're only getting worse?" The spleen fruit tree rocked, swaying like a massive pom-pom back and forth, as the ground underneath it loosened. For the first time since the backyard started collapsing on itself, Tabitha looked around. She blinked skeptically, though she did nothing to erase the scene unfolding before her. She turned to Harrison for an explanation, but he too seemed to be realizing just how violent the world around them had quickly turned. The ground quaked and they both nearly lost their balance. "Harry, what is happening?" she nervously asked. "I don't control this," he said as he found his footing and made his way so he could stand next to his wife. "It's bigger than me." They looked down in the hole and the bottom of it suddenly fell away. It was like it were yanked by an invisible hand, something reaching its way up through the mud to peel back the earth like an old bandage. The ground fell apart in long strips, leaving a gaping black chasm, an impossibly deep pit, in its place. There was no longer a backyard, only a bottomless hole. The spleen fruit tree shook more, uprooted. The ground was too weak, not thick enough to anchor its heavy trunk anymore. The tree jolted forward, falling towards the house that Harrison and Tabitha shared. It hit the roof first, splitting in two, sending shingles and splinters to the churning sky. The tree continued to fall, cutting through the bedroom and living room, foyer and bath. Aluminum siding exploded out from the sides, bending and breaking. The house looked as if it had been stepped on by a giant, as if a spleen fruit tree slammed sideways against the dirt. Tabitha said, "Everything is falling apart." Indeed, the entire neighborhood seemed to be sharing a fate similar to the Moss's backyard. And beyond the meager orbit of Brad and Tabitha, the entire city was under siege. Thunder and lightning filled the atmosphere as the ground beneath it churned in a maelstrom, sinking skyscrapers, consuming everything. Distant screams disappeared in the wind. "There's only one place left to go," Harrison said. "What? Where? Where are you supposed to go?" Tabitha fed through salty tears. Harrison took a deep breath and stepped up next to his wife. He held out his rake hand, bent metal prongs for fingers spread open towards her. She too was breathing heavy, chest pushing in and out. Fear contorted her once beautiful face into a funhouse vestige of itself. Confusion. Anger. She looked at Harrison's hand like it was toxic. And were the situation different, it would be toxic. His touch had been toxic for so fucking long she could have touched him and died instantly. But instead, her gaze drifted upward, met his eyes. There was something desperate in the way he was looking at her, something real, something vital. First off-putting like it were a trap, but then she recognized the fear in his face too, a mirror of her own. He wasn't trying to beguile her, to trick her. In this moment, perhaps too little too late, he was trying to save her. For better or worse, what else could she do? "I don't know about this," she said. "I don't either," he replied. She took his hand, and into the hole they leapt. End of part 1.